You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Wyatt Brenner, and I'm 28 years old from Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been living the van life for almost 2 years now, ever since I quit my suffocating desk job and converted my 2010 Sprinter into what I proudly call my mobile home. The freedom is addictive, waking up to different views, meeting fellow nomads, and documenting it all for my modest but growing social media following. When October rolled around this year, I decided to head north instead of chasing warmer weather like most van lifers. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan was supposed to be stunning in autumn, with those legendary color-changing forests reflecting off the waters of Lake Superior. I'd spent the previous night in a Walmart parking lot outside of Green Bay, but was eager to cross into Michigan's Up and find somewhere more scenic. My followers had been suggesting Marquette for weeks. Apparently, it had this perfect blend of rugged wilderness and small city amenities that made it ideal for someone like me. What they failed to mention were the stories, the whispers about the woods surrounding the city. If they had, maybe I would have stuck to the crowded RV parks instead of hunting for that perfect Instagram backdrop that would make my city friends jealous. The drive along the lake was hypnotic, miles of dense forest occasionally breaking to reveal glimpses of Superior's vast blue expanse. I arrived in Marquette as the afternoon light was getting that golden quality photographers obsess over. The city itself was charming in that small-town way, historic buildings downtown, friendly locals who waved as I cruised by in my obviously out-of-state van. I stopped at a local coffee shop, where the barista, Ellie, marked up my map with suggestions after I explained I was looking for dispersed camping spots. "There's a beautiful overlook about 7 miles north on County Road 550, she said, circling a spot with her pen. "Technically, overnight parking isn't allowed, but the rangers rarely check this time of year." She hesitated before adding, "Just stay in your van after dark. The locals avoid those woods at night." When I asked why, she shrugged it off with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Old mining country superstitions. Nothing to worry about." I should have pressed her more, should have noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she handed back my map. I spent the afternoon exploring downtown, stocking up on supplies at the local co-op, and scrolling through other vanlifers' posts about the area. Most stuck to established campgrounds or the beaches. Only one account mentioned the overlook Ellie had suggested, with a breathtaking photo of Superior at sunset, garnering thousands of likes. The caption read, "Worth the risk for this view. #vanlife, #pure Michigan, #no filter." That last hashtag would turn out to be darkly ironic, considering how filtered the truth about that location really was. As the day waned, I pointed my van north on County Road 550, following the winding route along the lakeshore. The road narrowed as I climbed, thick forests pressing in on both sides. The GPS signal flickered in and out, but I wasn't concerned. Ellie's hand-drawn map was clear enough. Just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, I found the unmarked turnoff she'd mentioned. A rough dirt path, barely wide enough for my van, led through a tunnel of dense pines before opening onto a rocky clearing perched above the lake. The view was even more spectacular than the Instagram post had suggested. The setting sun painted the sky in vivid oranges and pinks that reflected off the lake's surface, while the ancient pines framed the scene perfectly. I spent an hour setting up shots for my feed, completely losing track of time until the light began to fade. Only then did I notice the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of waves despite the vast lake below. Just an unnatural, pressing quiet that seemed to watch me with an awareness that made the hair on my neck stand up. I settled in for the night around 8 p.m. after posting my sunset shots and watching the likes roll in. The comments were overwhelmingly envious. "Dream spot," and "Location coordinates please," except for one that simply read, "Get out of there now." I chuckled nervously, assuming it was just some local troll, and deleted the notification. My van was well equipped for stealth camping. Blackout curtains, silent battery system, and a security setup that would alert me to any movement outside. I heated up some chili on my portable stove, cracked open a local craft beer I'd picked up in town, and tried to ignore the growing unease that had settled in my gut since the sun disappeared. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. I was drifting to sleep when my phone pinged with a notification, motion detected at the rear of the van. The security camera showed nothing but darkness, yet I could swear I heard something scraping against the metal exterior. Probably just branches in the wind, I reasoned, though the air had been completely still all evening. I double-checked that all doors were locked and tried to fall back asleep, but every few minutes, there'd be another sound. Sometimes scratching, sometimes what sounded disturbingly like whispering. Too low to make out words, but unmistakably human. By 2 a.m., I was sitting upright in bed, clutching my hunting knife and debating whether to start the engine and get the hell out of there. The rational part of my brain argued that I was being ridiculous. This was just normal forest sounds amplified by darkness and isolation. But another part, some primal instinct buried deep in my DNA, was screaming that I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't just passing wildlife. My phone had lost signal entirely, the bars vanishing shortly after sunset, which meant I couldn't even check if that ominous commenter had elaborated on their warning. I decided to peek through a small gap in my curtains, just to reassure myself there was nothing out there. The nearly full moon illuminated the clearing enough to see that my van was still alone on the overlook. No other vehicles, no obvious signs of people. But as I scanned the tree line, my blood turned to ice. Standing just at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the shadows, was what appeared to be a figure. Completely motionless, it seemed to be watching my van. I blinked hard, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks, but when I looked again, it had moved several feet closer. That's when I remembered what the coffee shop girl had said about staying in my van after dark, and the local superstitions she'd alluded to. Upper Michigan had a rich mining history, and with it came stories of tragedy, cave-ins, explosions, miners trapped forever in the darkness below. Some locals believed the spirits of those lost workers still wandered these forests, seeking to drag others down to join them in the eternal blackness beneath the earth. I'd laughed it off as tourist bait, but now, with that unnaturally still figure standing 50 feet from my van, those stories didn't seem so ridiculous. The decision came down to two terrible options: stay put and hope whatever was out there would lose interest by morning, or make a run for it down that narrow dirt road in the dark. The first option meant hours more of this psychological torture, while the second meant potentially driving right past that thing. As I weighed my choices, my phone suddenly lit up despite having no signal. A text message from an unknown number. They take one every autumn. Don't move until sunrise. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. How did someone have my number? And who the hell were they? I made my choice. I would wait until dawn. I positioned myself where I could see through the gap in the curtains without being easily spotted from outside, and prepared for a long night of vigilance. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened next. The figure by the tree line wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted better to the moonlight, I could make out more of them, emerging one by one from the forest. 7, 8, 9, each standing perfectly still, forming a loose semicircle around my van. And though I couldn't see their faces clearly, I knew with sickening certainty that every single one of them was staring directly at me. The figures didn't move for hours, just stood in their eerie semicircle watching my van. I remained frozen too, afraid that any movement might provoke them. By 4 a.m., my muscles ached from holding the same position, and my mind had cycled through every possible explanation, from cult members to elaborate prank to hallucination caused by carbon monoxide. I checked my detector twice. It showed normal levels. This was real. The strangest part was how they remained so unnaturally still. No shuffling of feet, no visible breath in the cold night air. It was as if they were photographs projected onto the darkness. Around 4:30, the whispering started again, louder this time, seeming to come from all directions at once. It had a rhythmic quality, almost like a chant, though I still couldn't make out any distinct words. The temperature inside my van plummeted, my breath suddenly visible in front of my face. The windows began to fog, then frost over, obscuring my view of the figures outside. I frantically wiped at the condensation, terrified of losing sight of them. When I cleared a small circle in the frost, my heart nearly stopped. They had moved closer, now forming a tight circle just feet from my vehicle. In the dim glow of my solar lights, I could finally see them clearly, and I almost wished I couldn't. They appeared human in basic shape, but wrong in all the details. Their skin had a grayish cast, like the pallor of old corpses, and hung loosely on frames too tall and thin to be natural. They wore what looked like tattered mining clothes from another century: canvas pants, heavy boots caked with ancient mud, and shirts that might once have been white but were now stained with what I prayed was just decades of dirt. Most disturbing were their eyes, black voids that reflected no light, set in gaunt faces partially obscured by matted beards. One of them, slightly taller than the rest, stepped forward and placed a hand on my van's hood. The metal sizzled on contact, frost spreading outward from his palm like a spiderweb. He tilted his head at an impossible angle, as if studying an interesting insect, then smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points. That's when I realized with horrifying clarity what I was dealing with. Not ghosts, not cultists, but something the locals called the Taken, miners who had survived cave-ins by resorting to unspeakable acts in the darkness, emerging changed, no longer fully human, cursed to roam these forests hunting for fresh souls to join their ranks. My entire body trembled as the tall one began to trace letters in the frost on my windshield, writing backward so I could read the message from inside. Join US below. The others pressed closer, their hands now all touching the van, creating more frost patterns that crystallized across every window. The temperature continued to drop rapidly, my teeth chattering uncontrollably as my heating system failed to combat the unnatural cold. My phone was dead, not just out of signal, but completely drained of battery despite having been at 80% moments before. I was utterly cut off from the outside world. The scratching on the exterior turned to pounding, slow, methodical thuds that rocked my entire van. They were testing for weaknesses, looking for a way in. I scrambled to the driver's seat, thinking I might still have a chance to start the engine and plow through them, but the key wouldn't turn in the ignition. Nothing electrical was working anymore. The otherworldly cold had somehow disabled everything. As panic threatened to overwhelm me, a sharp crack split the air. They had broken one of my rear windows. Frigid air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of earth, rot, and something metallic that might have been blood. Through the rearview mirror, I watched in horror as a gray, skeletal hand pushed through the broken window, reaching blindly inside. It was followed by another, and another, until hands were coming through every window, glass shattering all around me. I grabbed my knife and slashed at the nearest one, but the blade passed through it as if cutting smoke, leaving the appendage unharmed. The tall one's face appeared at my driver's side window, those black void eyes just inches from mine, separated only by frosted glass that was quickly cracking under pressure. His mouth moved, forming words I could now hear clearly in my mind. The earth is hungry, and you will feed it. Dawn was still at least an hour away when the driver's side window finally gave way, exploding inward in a shower of glass shards that cut my face and hands. I had seconds to act before those gnarled fingers could grab me. In desperation, I lunged across to the passenger side, frantically working to unlock and push open the door as hands clawed at my legs. The door swung open, and I tumbled out onto the frozen ground, scrambling to my feet and running without looking back. The overlook offered only one escape route, down a steep, wooded slope toward the lake. The forest was impossibly dark despite the moonlight, as if the trees themselves absorbed all illumination. I crashed through underbrush, slipping on frost-covered pine needles, each labored breath visible in the freezing air. Behind me, I could hear them in pursuit, not running, but moving with a terrible efficiency through the woods, their movements creating none of the crashing sounds mine did. It was as if they weren't disturbing the forest at all, simply passing through it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, now seeming to come from all sides, disorienting me as I tried to maintain a straight path downhill. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me tumbling down a ravine. Pain shot through my ankle as I landed, likely sprained, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet. I limped forward, using trees for support, knowing that stopping meant certain death, or worse, becoming like them. Through gaps in the canopy, I could see the first hints of pre-dawn light touching the sky above Lake Superior. If I could just reach the shoreline, maybe the coming daylight would drive them back. The local legend said they couldn't venture far from the old mine entrances once the sun rose. The trees began to thin, and I could hear waves lapping at the rocky shore. I was close. But my heart sank when I realized what lay between me and the lake. A wide ravine, at least 15 feet across, too far to jump with my injured ankle. At the bottom of the ravine was what appeared to be an old mining tunnel entrance, partially collapsed but still gaping like an open mouth into the earth. The whispers grew more excited, almost gleeful, as I stood trapped between the approaching Taken and this impassable obstacle. They had herded me here deliberately, I realized with sickening clarity. The tall one emerged from the tree line first, moving with that same unnatural gliding motion. The others followed, forming another semicircle, cutting off any chance of circling around the ravine. They made no move to rush me, confident in their trap. The tall one pointed toward the mine entrance below, his message clear: my only way out was down, into their domain. But that wasn't escape. It was surrender to a fate I couldn't begin to comprehend. The sky continued to lighten behind me, and I noticed something. The Taken were keeping their distance from the growing light reflecting off the lake. Inspiration struck as I remembered the emergency flare in my jacket pocket. Always carried for wilderness emergencies, never thinking I'd use it against something like this. With trembling hands, I retrieved it, watching as the Taken's black eyes fixed on the bright red tube. I struck the cap, and the flare ignited with a blinding crimson light that illuminated the entire forest around us. The effect was immediate and shocking. The Taken recoiled, their forms seeming to waver and distort in the artificial light. Their whispers turned to hisses of pain. I had found a weakness. Using the momentary advantage, I began moving laterally along the edge of the ravine, searching for a narrower point to cross. The flare wouldn't last long, maybe 5 minutes at most. The Taken kept their distance but followed, always maintaining that semicircle formation, waiting for my protection to burn out. I finally found what I was looking for, a fallen tree creating a natural bridge across the narrowest section of the ravine. Without hesitation, I stepped onto it, using my good leg to bear most of my weight as I inched across. The flare held out before me like a shield, its red light reflecting off the black water running far below. I was halfway across the log bridge when disaster struck. The flare, burning faster than normal in the supernaturally cold air, sputtered and died. Instantly, the forest plunged back into darkness, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch. I tried to move faster, but my injured ankle gave way, and I lost my balance. For one heart-stopping moment, I teetered on the edge of the log, arms windmilling desperately, then fell. Not into the ravine as I'd feared, but onto the log itself, landing hard on my stomach, the wind knocked out of me. I clung to the rough bark, gasping for breath, as I felt the log shift beneath me. They were on the log now too, their weight causing the dead tree to creak and tilt. I could feel the vibrations of their approach through the wood. With no other choice, I began dragging myself forward, inch by agonizing inch. The eastern sky was brightening rapidly now, and I could make out the opposite edge of the ravine, so close, yet impossibly far in my current state. A cold hand clasped around my ankle, its grip like iron. I kicked wildly with my good leg, and felt my boot connect with something solid that let out an all-too-human grunt of pain. That sound broke through my terror. These things could be hurt, which meant they weren't entirely supernatural. I twisted around to face my pursuer, finally getting a clear look in the growing dawn light. What I saw confirmed my worst fears, but also gave me hope. This close, I could see that beneath the dirt and decay, these were indeed men, horribly transformed, but still somehow physical beings. The one gripping my ankle had those same black eyes, but now I could see they were actually coal dust-stained scara surrounding pupils so dilated they appeared entirely black. With renewed determination, I kicked again, this time striking my attacker in the face. His grip loosened enough for me to pull free and continue my desperate crawl toward safety. The log shifted again dangerously, ancient wood beginning to splinter under the weight of multiple bodies. I reached the far side just as the first genuine rays of sunlight crested the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. To my amazement and relief, the Taken stopped their pursuit at the midpoint of the log, unwilling or unable to advance further into the direct morning light. I collapsed onto solid ground, turning to watch as my pursuers retreated back the way they'd come. The tall one remained the longest, those coal-black eyes boring into mine with unmistakable promise. They would be waiting when darkness fell again. The log bridge suddenly gave way with a tremendous crack, plummeting into the ravine and taking with it my only visible means of crossing back. I was safe for the moment, but cut off from my van, my supplies, and any easy path back to civilization. My phone was still in the van, and I had no idea how far I was from any road or trail. It took me 4 excruciating hours to limp through the forest until I finally reached a hiking trail, and another 2 before I encountered a group of morning hikers who helped me reach the ranger station. My story about being attacked by vagrants at the overlook was met with skepticism but not outright disbelief. Apparently, I wasn't the first to come down from those woods with a wild tale and unexplainable injuries. The park ranger, an older man named Halvorsen, gave me a long, knowing look before saying quietly, "You're lucky. Most who see the taken don't make it back to tell about it." My van was recovered 3 days later, after I convinced local police to accompany me back to the overlook. We found it exactly where I'd left it, but transformed. The exterior was covered in deep scratches that formed intricate symbols, the windows shattered, and the interior coated with a layer of coal dust so thick it looked like the inside of a mine shaft. Most disturbing of all was what we found scratched into the metal floor. A crude map showing dozens of old mining tunnel entrances throughout the forest, with one circled location marked with my name. I left Michigan that same day, driving south without stopping until I crossed the state line. I've never returned to the Upper Peninsula, and I've never again gone stealth camping anywhere that wasn't well populated. Because I know they're still there in those Marquette woods, watching and waiting for the next van dweller seeking that perfect wilderness shot. Someone who doesn't know to be afraid of what emerges after dark. My name is Meredith Sokolowski, and I'm 34 years old from Portland, Oregon. I've been living the Vanlife lifestyle for nearly 3 years now, documenting my travels through my moderately successful blog, Mere on the Move. My pride and joy is a meticulously renovated 1978 Volkswagen bus that I've named Rosie, a vehicle that's equal parts headache and happiness. What started as a 6-month sabbatical from my career in digital marketing turned into a complete lifestyle change when I realized I couldn't stomach returning to fluorescent lighting and performance reviews. The freedom of the open road had claimed me, despite the occasional mechanical breakdown and the challenges of finding safe places to sleep. I'd spent the summer meandering through the northern states, slowly making my way east from my native Pacific Northwest. By early September, I found myself in Michigan, a state I'd never properly explored beyond a brief childhood visit to relatives in Detroit. My online followers had been suggesting southwestern Michigan for weeks, specifically the Kalamazoo area, with its combination of college town energy and surprisingly diverse natural landscapes. I was particularly intrigued by the local craft brewery scene, as documenting unique local beers had become a popular segment on my blog. What made Kalamazoo extra appealing was a message from a follower named Vince who claimed to work at one of the breweries and offered to give me a private tour of their facilities. The drive into Kalamazoo was pleasant enough, rolling farmland giving way to increasingly dense suburbs before the modest downtown skyline appeared. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, when the Western Michigan University students were in classes and the streets were relatively quiet. My first stop was Bronson Park in the center of downtown, where I planned to gather information at the visitor center and maybe grab a coffee before meeting Vince. The park was surprisingly empty for such a beautiful September day, with only a few people hurrying across rather than lingering to enjoy the sunshine. Inside the visitor center, I was greeted by an older woman with a tight gray bun and glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. "You passing through or staying a while?" she asked, eyeing me with that particular blend of Midwestern friendliness and suspicion reserved for obvious outsiders. When I mentioned I was a travel blogger looking to explore the area for a few days, her demeanor shifted subtly. "Well, you picked an interesting time to visit," she said, sliding a map across the counter. "Just be mindful where you park that colorful bus of yours at night. We've had some incidents with overnight visitors recently." I pressed her for details, but she deflected, suggesting I check out the breweries downtown and the nature center at Asylum Lake Preserve. When I mentioned I was meeting someone named Vince from one of the local breweries, her hand froze momentarily over the map. Which brewery did you say? When I admitted I didn't know, we'd only communicated through my blog's messaging system. She made a small, disapproving noise. Just be careful about meeting strangers, dear. Kalamazoo's a friendly place, but we've had 3 vanlifers go missing in the last 2 months. The police think they moved on, but she trailed off, leaving the implication hanging heavily in the air. The chill that ran down my spine should have been warning enough, but I'd grown accustomed to locals trying to spook visitors with urban legends and exaggerated dangers. Besides, I'd arranged to meet Vince in a public place, the beer garden of Bell's Brewery, not exactly the setting for a kidnapping. Still, I made a mental note to share my location with my sister back in Portland before the meeting, just to be safe. I thanked the woman and headed back to Rosie, planning to freshen up at a nearby truck stop before my 5 p.m. meeting. As I walked away, I could feel her eyes following me, could almost sense the words she wasn't saying. What I couldn't have known then was that Kalamazoo harbored a secret darker than missing vanlifers, a local legend with roots stretching back to the city's asylum days, when the sprawling psychiatric hospital on the hill overlooked the growing town below. I couldn't have known that the beer industry that put Kalamazoo on the map had connections to that asylum's experimental treatments, or that some traditions never truly die in small Midwestern cities. I couldn't have known that by nightfall, I'd be fighting not just for my freedom, but for my very sense of self. The meeting with Vince at Bell's Brewery seemed normal enough at first. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of forearm tattoos that seemed mandatory for brewery employees these days. He knew an impressive amount about beer, walking me through a flight of samples while explaining the history of Kalamazoo's brewing renaissance. It was only when I mentioned the visitor center lady's warning about missing vanlifers that I noticed the first red flag, a momentary tightening around his eyes before he laughed it off. Classic Mrs. Pendleton, always scaring tourists with those stories. Though I guess there was that one guy from Colorado who disappeared. His van turned up empty at Wolf Lake. Something in his delivery felt rehearsed, and I found myself drinking less than usual, keeping my wits sharp. When he offered to show me a locals-only spot where I could safely park overnight, completely legal but unknown to most visitors, I politely declined, saying I'd already arranged to stay at a campground outside town. The lie came easily, born from years of learning to trust my instincts on the road. His persistence was the second red flag. That place charges $30 a night. My spot is free, and I can guarantee no one will bother you there. The intensity in his eyes didn't match his casual tone. I made an excuse about needing to make a phone call and stepped outside, my heart racing as I texted my location to my sister with a quick message. On a brewery tour with local guide Vince. If you don't hear from me by 9 p.m., call Kalamazoo police. When I returned, Vince had ordered us another round I hadn't asked for, including a seasonal brew he particularly recommended, a deep amber beer called Asylum Amber that he claimed was made with a century-old recipe. I pretended to sip it while steering the conversation towards safer topics, like upcoming local events. As sunset approached, I announced I needed to head to my campground before dark. Vince immediately offered to lead me there, saying the directions could be tricky. When I declined again, something shifted in his demeanor, the friendly brewery guy facade cracking just enough to reveal something colder underneath. You really should try that Asylum Amber before you go, he insisted, pushing the barely touched glass toward me. It's our most special brew. Changes your perspective on things. The way he emphasized those last words sent goosebumps racing up my arms. I made it back to Rosie without incident, but couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Rather than head to the fictional campground, I drove to a well-lit Walmart parking lot where several other RVs were already settled for the night, safety in numbers being a cardinal rule of van life. As I prepared a simple dinner on my portable stove, I noticed a sedan circling the parking lot slowly. It passed my distinctive VW bus 3 times before parking several spaces away. No one got out, but I could see the silhouette of a driver watching me through the windshield. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by strange dreams where I wandered endless hospital corridors, pursued by figures in brewing aprons who carried old-fashioned medical instruments. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something tapping lightly on Rosie's window. Peering through a crack in my blackout curtains, I saw nothing in the immediate vicinity, but the sedan was still there, now parked directly across from me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with mounting horror that every other RV and camper that had been in the lot earlier was now gone. Somehow, in the few hours I'd been asleep, I'd become completely alone in what should have been a busy overnight parking area. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. I fumbled for my phone to call 911, only to find the screen wouldn't turn on despite being fully charged when I'd gone to bed. My portable battery packs were similarly dead, along with my solar-powered lantern. The only light came from distant parking lot lamps and the eerie blue glow of my analog clock, which now showed 3:33 a.m., though it had definitely been past 4 o'clock when I'd last checked the time. Something was very wrong, and every instinct screamed that I needed to get out of this parking lot immediately. I crawled to the driver's seat, hands trembling as I reached for the keys in the ignition, only to freeze as my headlights illuminated what was now standing directly in front of my bus. Vince, flanked by 4 others in identical brewery uniforms, all wearing strange copper-colored masks that covered the upper halves of their faces. They made no move to approach as I frantically tried to start Rosie's engine. The old VW sputtered and wheezed but wouldn't catch, each failed attempt sending waves of panic through my chest. Through the windshield, I could see Vince slowly removing his copper mask, revealing an expression of almost tender concern that contrasted sharply with the predatory stillness of his posture. The others remained motionless, their masked faces tilted at identical angles, like curious birds studying wounded prey. When Vince finally spoke, his voice came through with unnatural clarity, as if he were sitting beside me rather than standing 20 feet away. "The asylum amber would have made this easier, Meredith," he said, his tone genuinely regretful. "It opens the mind to the transition. Without it, the process will be more distressing." The word distressing hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that sent cold sweat trickling down my spine. I desperately tried the engine again, but instead of the familiar rumble, the radio suddenly blared to life at full volume. Rather than music or static, it emitted a rhythmic series of tones that seemed to pulse in time with the swaying movements the masked figures had begun to make. The sound triggered an immediate migraine, driving ice picks of pain behind my eyes. As I lunged to turn it off, my hand passed through the knob as if it were made of smoke. Panic surged as I tried again with the same impossible result. My fingers simply couldn't interact with the dashboard controls. The radio continued its maddening broadcast as Vince approached my driver's side window, placing his palm flat against the glass. "Kalamazoo has always needed special people," he said, his voice somehow audible over the pulsing tones. "The brewery's just a front. Our real work continues the research the asylum began a century ago, finding those whose minds can be expanded." With mounting horror, I realized the parking lot around us was transforming. The asphalt rippled like water, the yellow lines melting and reforming into strange spiral patterns. The distant lamp posts stretched impossibly tall, their light taking on the sickly green-blue quality of old hospital fluorescence. Reality itself seemed to be unraveling at the edges, as if whatever was happening wasn't just in my mind, but was actually warping the physical world around us. I fumbled with the door lock, but like the radio knob, my fingers passed right through it. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs as I realized I was trapped inside a vehicle I suddenly couldn't physically interact with. "Your followers led us to you," Vince continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than whatever horrific fate he had planned. "Your blog posts show remarkable perception. You see patterns others miss, connections in seemingly unrelated events. The asylum directors would have called you sensitive. We call you receptive." He traced a symbol on my window with his finger, leaving behind a glowing residue that burned my eyes to look at directly. 333 candidates tested this year. Only 7 proved truly receptive. You'll be number 8, if you survive the initiation. The other masked figures had completely surrounded my bus now, each placing their palms against the metal exterior. As they did, the interior began to fill with a faint copper-colored mist that smelled of hops and something medicinal. I tried holding my breath, but my burning lungs eventually forced me to inhale. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. My perception fractured like a kaleidoscope, showing me multiple overlapping versions of the inside of my van. In one, I was alone. In another, hospital orderlies in antique uniforms stood over me. In a third, the masked brewery workers were somehow inside with me, though the doors remained closed. Through this perceptual chaos, Vince's voice remained my one constant anchor. Kalamazoo Asylum pioneered consciousness expansion through controlled dissociation long before psychedelics were understood. When the asylum closed, the brewers protected the knowledge, hiding the treatments in specialty batches. You're experiencing decades of refined technique, Meredith. Your mind is being prepared for the collective. As he spoke, I became aware of other voices joining his. Whispers at first, then a growing chorus of thoughts that weren't my own flowing directly into my consciousness. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of distinct personalities suddenly pressing against the boundaries of my sense of self. The copper mist thickened, and with each breath, the barrier between my mind and this invasive chorus of others grew thinner. Fragments of memories not my own flashed before my eyes. Asylum wards from a century ago, secret brewery basements where patients were brought for special treatments, decades of vanlifers and drifters lured to Kalamazoo and never seen again. With dawning horror, I realized the truth. I wasn't just being kidnapped. These people were attempting to absorb my consciousness into some kind of grotesque hive mind that had been growing for generations, harvesting the minds of receptive outsiders passing through their city. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't fighting for my freedom or even my life, but for the continued existence of my individual consciousness. These brewers were modern-day psychic vampires, collecting minds like specimens, each new absorption strengthening their collective. Through the mental noise of all those captured consciousnesses, I caught glimpses of their ultimate goal, accumulating enough psychic energy to extend their influence beyond Kalamazoo, to create similar collectives in other cities until the entire world was joined in their twisted communion. I was just another battery for their expanding power. The copper mist had become so thick I could barely see my own hands, and the chorus of voices was becoming harder to distinguish from my own thoughts. I knew with terrible certainty that I had minutes, perhaps only seconds, before my sense of self dissolved completely into their collective. With no ability to physically interact with my van, traditional escape was impossible, but something Vince had said echoed back to me. I was receptive, sensitive to patterns others missed. If this was a psychic attack, perhaps I could mount a psychic defense. I closed my eyes, focusing on the core memories that defined me as Meredith. The smell of my mother's kitchen, the exact sensation of the ocean at Cannon Beach where I'd learned to swim, the pride of the first time I fixed Rosie's engine myself. I built a mental fortress from these intensely personal experiences, memories so uniquely mine that they couldn't be diluted by the invading collective. The pressure of the other minds seemed to recede slightly, creating a small bubble of clarity around my consciousness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to think. In that moment of clarity, I noticed something crucial. While I couldn't interact with my van, I could still feel the weight of my crystal pendant against my skin. A gift from my sister. I'd always worn it as a good luck charm, never putting much stock in the seller's claims about its protective properties. But the crystal remained solid and tangible, while everything else seemed increasingly dreamlike. On instinct, I grasped it tightly, focusing all my mental energy into the stone. The effect was immediate and shocking. The crystal grew hot in my palm, and the copper mist recoiled from it, as if burned. Vince's voice cut through the chaos, now tinged with alarm. "She's resisting. Strengthen the binding." The masks outside began a low, droning chant that made the mist pulse and thicken again. I clutched the crystal harder, swinging it before me like a pendulum, using it to carve a small clear space in the suffocating miasma. With each swing, I reclaimed another inch of my van from their influence. The voices in my head became more frantic, some now screaming in anger while others, perhaps the most recently absorbed, whispered encouragement, recognizing in me a possible liberator. As I fought this psychic battle, I noticed something extraordinary happening to Rosie. Where the crystal's arc passed, reality seemed to stabilize, the normal physical properties of my van reasserting themselves. Understanding dawned. Their ritual had pulled my consciousness partially into their collective mental plane, but hadn't fully disconnected me from the physical world. The crystal was somehow grounding me, bringing me back to material reality. If I could fully reconnect with the physical plane, I might be able to escape before they adjusted their technique to counter my resistance. With renewed determination, I swung the crystal in widening arcs, mentally pushing against the boundaries of the trance they'd induced. The masked figures outside began to shake violently, their chanting becoming discordant as their control weakened. Vince pounded on my window, his face contorted with rage and fear. "Stop fighting. You'll tear the veil. You'll release them all." His warning only confirmed I was on the right track. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I could potentially free all those they'd captured over the decades. The moment my crystal-wielding hand touched the physical ignition key was the turning point. Reality snapped back into focus with such force that I was thrown against my seat. The radio abruptly silenced, the copper mist vanished, and Rosie's familiar interior solidified around me. Through the windshield, I could see the masked figures staggering backward as if struck. Vince alone remained standing, his eyes wide with disbelief. Without hesitation, I turned the key, and Rosie's engine roared to life with unusual vigor, as if sharing my desperate need to escape. I floored the accelerator, aiming directly at the space between Vince and another masked figure. They leapt aside as my VW bus lurched forward, tires squealing against the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I could see them recovering quickly, sprinting toward parked vehicles. I had maybe 30 seconds before they would be in pursuit. I took a hard right out of the parking lot, tires protesting, and accelerated down the empty pre-dawn streets of Kalamazoo. I had no plan beyond putting distance between myself and those psychic predators, but as I drove, a strange certainty formed in my mind. I needed to reach Asylum Lake Preserve. The name itself had seemed like a dark joke earlier, but now it pulled at me with undeniable urgency. I drove frantically through Kalamazoo's deserted streets, the headlights of pursuing vehicles appearing intermittently in my mirrors. The crystal pendant still clutched in one hand, steering wheel in the other. I followed an intuition I couldn't explain toward Asylum Lake. The sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn gray when I reached the nature preserve's deserted parking area, slamming Rosie to a halt at the trailhead. Something was calling me to the water, not Vince and his collective, but something older, something that might offer protection against them. The trail was dark under the forest canopy as I sprinted along it, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I heard car doors slamming, voices calling. They were closing in. The trail opened suddenly onto the lakeshore, the water black and still in the dim light. Without hesitation, I waded in, the crystal burning hot against my palm. As the cold water reached my waist, I heard Vince's voice from the shoreline, unusually panicked. "Meredith, stop. You don't understand what you're doing. That lake isn't what you think it is." I turned to face my pursuers, now lined up along the shore, their copper masks gleaming dully in the growing light. None of them followed me into the water. I noticed they kept a clear distance from the lake's edge. Vince had removed his mask, revealing eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine fear. The original asylum director drowned himself in this lake after his experiments went too far, he called. "What flows between us, what you call our collective, it started with him. But he's still here, Meredith, in the lake, and he's hungry for new minds, especially receptive ones like yours." As if summoned by his words, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle beneath the water, not a physical touch, but a psychic tendril reaching into my mind. Unlike the invasive press of the Brewers Collective, this presence was ancient and patient, offering rather than taking. In my mind's eye, I saw the asylum director's last moments. His growing horror as he realized his consciousness-expanding experiments had opened a door that couldn't be closed, his desperate choice to contain what he'd unleashed by binding it to the lake with his own death. The Brewers weren't continuing the asylum's work. They were containing its consequences, feeding it outsiders to keep it from spreading beyond Kalamazoo. They were both jailers and acolytes of something they didn't fully understand. As this knowledge flowed into me from the lake's dark consciousness, I faced an impossible choice: allow myself to be absorbed into the Brewers Collective or accept the lake's offer of protection, knowing it wanted me for purposes I couldn't comprehend. Time seemed to slow as I stood waist-deep in the frigid water, the crystal burning in my hand, the psychic tendrils of the lake entity wrapping around my consciousness. In that suspended moment, I made a third choice. I hurled my crystal pendant as hard as I could toward the center of the lake, putting every ounce of my will behind it. You want a receptive mind? I shouted at both the brewers and the lake entity. Try receiving this. As the crystal broke the surface, a blinding flash erupted, followed by a psychic shockwave that knocked everyone on shore to the ground. What happened next defies easy explanation. The lake began to boil, not with heat, but with fragmented consciousness. Hundreds of individual minds suddenly breaking free of both the Brewers Collective and the lake entity's grip. I felt them rush past me, around me, through me, lost souls finding release. Some had been trapped for decades, others for only months. I recognized the recent Vanlifers among them, their relief palpable as they dispersed like mist in the morning light. The crystal had acted as a catalyst, disrupting the delicate balance of power that had trapped these souls between the brewers and the lake. Vince and the others scrambled to their feet, their faces masks of terror as they witnessed the collapse of their generational work. They turned and fled back down the trail without a backward glance, their purpose destroyed, their power broken. I dragged myself from the lake, exhausted but whole, my mind entirely my own again. As I reached the shore, a final psychic message reached me from the fading lake entity. Not words exactly, but a sense of gratitude mixed with warning. Whatever dark door the asylum director had opened a century ago hadn't been closed by my actions, merely redistributed. I staggered back to Rosie as the sun finally crested the horizon, casting golden light across Asylum Lake's now placid surface. My event started on the first try, as if nothing supernatural had ever touched it. With shaking hands, I pointed it toward the interstate, determined to put as many miles between myself and Kalamazoo as possible. I drove nonstop for 14 hours, crossing 3 state lines before I felt safe enough to rest. That night, in an Ohio rest stop, I deleted my blog and all its content, created a new email address, and changed my phone number. 3 months later, I still live in Rosie, but I no longer document my travels or connect with other Vanlifers online. I avoid craft breweries entirely and have developed an aversion to copper that makes even handling pennies difficult. Sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear whispers of the collective consciousness I briefly touched, not controlling anymore, just watching, waiting. The visitor center lady was right about the missing Vanlifers, but wrong about why they disappeared. And sometimes I wonder about the hundreds of minds I released that morning at Asylum Lake, where they went, what they might do with their newfound freedom after decades of imprisonment. Most unsettling of all is what I found when I finally checked the photos I'd taken during my brief time in Kalamazoo. In every single one, no matter the location or time of day, Asylum Lake is somehow visible in the background, even in shots taken downtown, miles from the actual lake. And in the very center of each watery reflection, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it, the glint of a crystal pendant, still sending out ripples across a surface that will never again be still. My name is Julian Mercer, and I'm 31 years old from Austin, Texas. I've been living the van life for about a year and a half, ever since I quit my soul-crushing job as a software developer to pursue my true passion, landscape photography. My mobile home is a meticulously converted 2015 Mercedes Sprinter that I've outfitted with everything I need, including a custom-built darkroom setup for developing my film photographs. I still do freelance coding gigs when money gets tight, but mostly I fund my travels through print sales and the occasional photography workshop. The freedom to chase the perfect light across the country has been worth every sacrifice, even if I sometimes miss having consistent Wi-Fi and a shower that doesn't require quarters. Northern Michigan had been on my photography bucket list for years, particularly the Sleeping Bear Dunes and the famous cherry orchards around Traverse City. I timed my visit for late September, hoping to catch the beginning of the fall colors while avoiding the summer tourist crowds. The drive up the western coast of Michigan had been stunning, the vast expanse of Lake Michigan often visible through the trees, looking more like an ocean than a lake. I'd spent the previous 3 nights at various state parks, but was running low on fresh water and desperately needed to do laundry, which is why I decided to spend a night or 2 in Traverse City proper before heading into the more remote areas. I arrived in Traverse City on a Thursday afternoon, immediately charmed by the brick buildings of the downtown area and the glittering bay beyond. After filling up my water tanks at a local RV park and starting a load of laundry at a laundromat, I decided to explore on foot while waiting. The city seemed to be in transition, summer tourists mostly gone, but the fall-color tourists not yet arrived in force. Many shops had reduced hours signs posted, and some restaurants were closed for the season. Still, there was a pleasant energy to the place. Locals reclaiming their town after the busy season, greeting each other by name on the sidewalks. At a small coffee shop called Bay Beans, I struck up a conversation with the barista, a woman in her 50s named Diane who'd lived in Traverse City her whole life. When I mentioned I was a photographer looking for interesting local spots, her eyes lit up. "You picked a perfect time to visit," she said, pulling out a local map and circling several locations. "The orchards are gorgeous right now, especially the old abandoned ones out past Silver Lake Road. Most tourists don't know about those." When I asked why they were abandoned, a shadow crossed her face. "The Harmon Orchard Massacre back in '87. Whole family killed among their cherry trees. Terrible business. The neighboring orchards kept going, but that particular property's been empty since." My interest was immediately piqued. Abandoned places make for compelling photographs, and the macabre history would add an interesting dimension to my portfolio. When I pressed for more details about the massacre, Diane became noticeably uncomfortable. "Not something we talk about much here. Some say the property's cursed. Strange things happen there every few years." She lowered her voice. 3 summers ago, a group of college kids went out there to film some ghost hunting video. Only one came back, raving about the red man in the trees. Poor girl's still in a psychiatric facility up in Kalkaska. She quickly changed the subject, pointing out safer tourist attractions on the map. By the time I finished my coffee and photography chat with Diane, my laundry was done. I spent the rest of the afternoon scouting locations she'd recommended, planning to hit the abandoned orchard early the next morning for the golden hour light. I found a quiet spot to park for the night in a Meyer parking lot on the edge of town, where several other RVs were already settled in. As dusk fell, I edited photos from earlier in my trip, occasionally glancing at the local news on my laptop. Buried among community announcements and tourism pieces was a small article that caught my attention. Annual missing persons case still unsolved 10 years later. It detailed how every September for the past decade, exactly one visitor to the Grand Traverse area had vanished without a trace, most presumed to have drowned in the bay or gotten lost in the surrounding forests. I went to sleep that night with plans to visit the abandoned Harmon Orchard at sunrise, my mind filled with visions of gnarled cherry trees silhouetted against the morning sky. I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m., wanting to catch the first light and hopefully avoid any other photographers or urban explorers. What I didn't know then was that the Harmon property wasn't just marked by human tragedy. It was the epicenter of something far older, something that had been feeding on the region long before European settlers arrived with their fruit trees. The Odawa people had called it Mikan's Mikwa, the red harvester, and they had performed annual sacrifices to keep it contained within a small grove of trees. The Harmon family had unknowingly planted their cherry orchard directly over that ancient prison, breaking seals and boundaries meant to last forever. And now, I was driving straight toward it, just as September was drawing to a close, when the veil between worlds was already growing thin. I woke before my alarm, an unusual restlessness pulling me from sleep. Outside my van windows, the Meyer parking lot was silent and bathed in the strange half-light before dawn. A thin fog had settled overnight, giving the streetlights hazy halos. I made a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a protein bar, eager to reach the abandoned orchard before sunrise. As I pulled up the location on my GPS, I noticed something odd. A small text message from an unknown number had arrived at exactly 3:33 a.m. The Harmon trees only bear fruit for those willing to water them. Stay away. I dismissed it as a wrong number or spam, though the timing was admittedly creepy. Probably just a coincidence. The drive out of town was eerie in the pre-dawn darkness. The fog thickened as I left the city limits, reducing visibility to mere feet in some places. My headlights reflected off the mist, creating the disorienting impression of driving through a white tunnel. The GPS directed me onto increasingly narrow roads, until finally instructing me to turn onto an unmarked dirt path that didn't look like it had seen traffic in years. Trusting my Sprinter's all-wheel drive, I carefully navigated the overgrown track, wincing as branches scraped against the sides of my home on wheels. After about half a mile, the trees suddenly opened up to reveal what had clearly once been an orchard, rows upon rows of cherry trees, now wild and overgrown, their silhouettes like hunched figures in the growing light. I parked at what appeared to be the remains of a gravel turnaround and gathered my photography gear, my trusted Hasselblad medium format camera, tripod, and a bag of various filters and lenses. The fog here was patchy, creating dramatic opportunities for shots as the sun began to illuminate the mist from above. I set off on foot down the central row of trees, noting how the neat agricultural grid was still visible despite decades of neglect. As a photographer, I was in heaven. The gnarled branches, the play of light through the fog, the occasional glimpse of Lake Michigan in the distance. I became so absorbed in capturing images that I didn't immediately notice the oddities. The first sign something was wrong came when I realized I'd been photographing for almost 2 hours, yet the light hadn't changed. The sun seemed fixed at that perfect golden hour angle, despite what my watch claimed was now mid-morning. I checked my phone, no signal, and the battery had drained from 90% to 15% in less than 2 hours. More disturbing was what I discovered when reviewing the images on my digital backup camera. I always shot both film and digital as insurance. While the first dozen shots were normal, the later images showed strange crimson streaks among the trees, like elongated figures moving between frames. In the most recent shots, what appeared to be faces were visible in the bark of the nearest trees, not pareidolia, but distinct human features contorted in expressions of pain. I decided it was time to head back to my van, suddenly uneasy about being alone in this forgotten place. That's when I realized I couldn't identify which direction I'd come from. The neat rows had somehow shifted while I was working, the paths now curving and intersecting in impossible ways. Fog had closed in again, limiting visibility to about 20 feet in any direction. I tried to use the position of the sun to orient myself, only to discover that it now appeared to be in multiple positions at once, golden light seemingly coming from different angles through the mist. My rational mind suggested this was just some strange atmospheric effect, but the primitive part of my brain was screaming that I needed to get out immediately. I chose a direction that seemed most likely and began walking quickly, my camera gear now feeling unnecessarily heavy. After 10 minutes of increasingly panicked hiking, I should have reached the edge of the orchard or my van, but the trees continued endlessly in every direction. Worse, I began to notice things moving in my peripheral vision, darting shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. The air had taken on a sweet, cloying smell reminiscent of rotting fruit, and the fog now had a pinkish tinge like diluted blood. My phone was completely dead, the compass app I tried to use showing the needle spinning in continuous circles before the screen went black. The final straw came when I heard someone, or something, whisper my name. Julian. It came from behind me, the voice like dry leaves rustling. I spun around to find nothing but trees and fog. Then again, from a different direction, Julian. And again, from yet another, Julian. Soon it was coming from everywhere at once, a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. That's when I noticed the cherry trees were now bearing fruit. Bright red cherries hanging heavily from every branch, despite it being completely the wrong season. And the bark of the nearest tree was changing. What I'd first taken for gnarled patterns in the wood were revealing themselves as faces pressing outward, as if the tree contained people trying to emerge. One face in particular caught my attention, a middle-aged man with a farmer's weathered features, his mouth opening and closing silently. With horrifying clarity, I realized I was looking at what must be Mr. Harmon himself, somehow preserved or imprisoned within the very trees he'd tended in life. The realization that I was seeing actual human faces in the trees broke something in my mind. The rational framework I'd been desperately clinging to shattered completely. These weren't just any faces, they were showing expressions of conscious suffering. Some mouths moved in silent screams. Others seemed to be trying to form words, warning me perhaps. But the face I assumed was Mr. Harmon was the most disturbing. His eyes followed me with clear intelligence and what looked like desperate urgency. When I involuntarily stepped closer, his features became more distinct, pushing against the bark like a foot pressing against a thin fabric. His lips finally formed words I could understand by reading them. Run. It harvests. I backed away in horror, only to bump into something solid behind me where there should have been nothing but fog. Before I could turn, hands gripped my shoulders. Not human hands, but something that felt like woody branches wrapped in damp, rotting fruit. A voice spoke directly into my ear, a wet, pulpy sound that somehow formed English words. Your fear tastes sweet, photographer. Like perfectly ripened cherries. The grip tightened painfully, sharp twigs digging through my jacket. Your kind always captures such beautiful images before joining our orchard. Show me what you've seen through your precious lenses. With a strength born of pure terror, I tore myself free and sprinted blindly into the fog, abandoning my tripod but clutching my camera bag to my chest. Behind me, something gave pursuit, not with footsteps, but with a sound like rustling leaves and cracking branches that somehow moved faster than any human could run. The whispers intensified, now sounding like dozens of voices calling my name from all directions. The fog parted momentarily, revealing a horrific sight. The trees themselves were moving, their roots pulling free from the earth as they shifted position to cut off my escape routes. The neat orchard rows were now a deliberate maze, constantly reconfiguring to keep me trapped within. I ducked under a low-hanging branch, only to find myself face to face with what I can only describe as the red harvester itself. It wore the basic shape of a man, but was composed entirely of twisted cherry wood, dripping with what looked like red sap, but smelled metallically of blood. Where a face should be was a knot of branches forming approximate features, with deep hollows for eyes that glowed with the same golden light I'd been photographing all morning. The creature's body continuously shifted and reformed, branches extending and retracting like probing fingers. Most disturbing were the human faces visible within its twisted wooden chest, dozens of them, pressed against the surface from inside, including faces that matched the decades of missing persons from the news article I'd read. Your confusion is delicious, it said, the words formed not by a mouth, but by the rustling of leaves. Every year we need one more to strengthen the growth, to feed the roots, to maintain the boundary. As it spoke, the ground beneath my feet became soft and yielding, my boots sinking slightly into soil that seemed to be actively pulling me downward. The native peoples understood the arrangement. One willing sacrifice each year. Then the Harmon family built their home here, broke the circle, refused to pay the tribute. The creature's wooden approximation of a head tilted. So we took them all. But it wasn't enough. The boundary weakens annually without the proper ritual. So now we must take travelers. Outsiders. Like you. My mind raced, searching desperately for any way out of this nightmare. The creature was still talking, explaining how it had lured me here, how the entire orchard was essentially a single organism with a collective consciousness comprised of all those it had harvested over the centuries. How my consciousness would join theirs, my body becoming nutrients for the roots while my mind remained eternally aware. As it spoke, tendrils of root matter began winding around my ankles, securing me in place. I felt a strange resignation starting to creep over me, a supernatural lethargy that made resistance seem pointless. Was this how it overcame its victims? Some kind of psychic sedation? Fighting the unnatural calm trying to overtake me. I fumbled in my camera bag, looking for anything that might help. My fingers closed around my emergency flare, always carried when photographing in remote locations. With the last of my willpower, I struck it against the igniter, and the orchard was suddenly bathed in harsh red chemical light. The effect was immediate and shocking. The creature recoiled with a sound like 1,000 branches breaking at once. The faces in the trees contorted in shared pain, and the roots around my ankles momentarily loosened. The red harvester hissed, "Fire is temporary. We are eternal. When your flare dies, we will still be here, photographer." But I noticed it keeping its distance, the branches of its body curling away from the burning magnesium. In that moment of distraction, I spotted something through a gap in the fog, a weathered wooden structure that looked like it might have been the Harmon family's equipment barn. Nowhere near where my van should be, but at least it was a solid human construction that might offer some protection. Clutching the flare before me like a weapon, I broke into a run toward the building. the angry rustling of the entire orchard rising to a roar behind me. The roots tried to trip me, branches whipped at my face drawing blood, and the fog itself seemed to thicken in my path. But the flare's light carved a reluctant pathway. I reached the barn's weathered door and threw myself inside, slamming it behind me. In the crimson glow of the flare, I took in my surroundings and immediately wished I hadn't. What I'd found wasn't salvation. It was the Red Harvester's true heart, and I had just walked willingly into its inner sanctum. The barn's interior defied all logic and natural law. What should have been a simple agricultural building stretched impossibly in all directions, far larger inside than out. The walls and ceiling were composed entirely of fused cherry trees, their branches interwoven so tightly they created solid surfaces. But what turned my blood to ice was what hung from these branches. Human bodies in various stages of transformation, suspended by woody tendrils that pierced their flesh. Some were recent enough to still look mostly human, while others had been partially absorbed, their limbs and torsos already morphing into branches and trunks. Most horrifying were the fully transformed ones. Human bodies now completely wooden except for their faces, which remained grotesquely human and conscious, their eyes tracking my movements with desperate awareness. In the center of this chamber of horrors stood what could only be described as a throne, formed from a massive cherry tree stump. Seated upon it was the preserved body of a Native American man, his mummified remains adorned with faded paint and what appeared to be ceremonial regalia. Roots and branches had grown through and around him, using his body as a framework, yet somehow he too seemed aware, his desiccated eyes moving to fix on me as I stood paralyzed in the doorway. A voice spoke directly into my mind. I was the last willing keeper, the final guardian who understood the pact. When I died with no successor, the Red One began to free itself. The Harmons were just the first to feed its growing hunger. The flare in my hand sputtered, its chemical fuel nearly exhausted. In its dying light, I saw a movement all around the barn's perimeter. The faces in the walls were pushing forward, branches parting to allow the Red Harvester's many manifestations to enter from all sides. I was surrounded, with no visible exit except the door I'd entered through, which was now blocked by the main form of the creature. The throne's occupant spoke in my mind again. There is a way to escape, photographer. The ancient boundary can be restored, but it requires a willing sacrifice. One who understands what they're giving up, and does so freely to contain what lives here. Understanding dawned with horrible clarity. This entity, whatever it truly was, had been contained by a succession of voluntary guardians over centuries. When that tradition ended, it began taking unwilling victims, but those couldn't properly maintain the boundary. Each September, as the veil thinned, it needed to consume another outsider just to maintain its weakened prison. The keeper's desiccated head nodded slightly, confirming my thoughts. I had two choices: attempt to flee and almost certainly join the victims displayed around me, or voluntarily become the new keeper, sacrificing my freedom but potentially stopping this entity from spreading beyond the orchard. The flare gave one final bright flare before dying completely, plunging the barn into a darkness broken only by the faint glow emanating from the transformed victims. In that moment of darkness, I made my desperate move. I swung my heavy camera bag with all my strength at the nearest window-like opening between the branches. To my shock and relief, the branches shattered like glass, revealing not the orchard outside, but a swirling vortex of red mist. Without hesitation, I hurled myself through this opening, having no idea where it might lead, but knowing anything was better than remaining in that nightmarish barn. I experienced a sensation of falling through crimson fog, disembodied whispers brushing past me like physical entities. Images flashed through my mind. The original Native American settlement, the first European surveyors, the Harmon family building their home, and their final night alive when the trees themselves tore through the house to claim them. I saw decades of missing hikers and tourists, each one now part of the collective consciousness of the orchard. And beneath it all, something ancient and hungry that had been here long before humans arrived. Something that fed on fear and consciousness rather than flesh. Something that was using this psychic corridor to access my memories. The falling sensation abruptly ended as I slammed into solid ground, the breath knocked from my lungs. Gasping for air, I found myself lying not in the orchard or the barn, but on the dirt track leading to the Harmon property. My van was just visible through the thinning morning fog, exactly where I'd parked it. For one hopeful moment, I thought I might have imagined the whole terrible experience. Perhaps I'd slipped and hit my head before even entering the orchard. Then I noticed three things that destroyed that comforting possibility. My camera gear was gone except for the bag itself. Cherrywood splinters were embedded deeply in my palms and forearms, and something was carved into the hood of my van, a crude image of a tree with a human face, below which were the words, "The boundary holds until next September." I scrambled into my van, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine started on the first try, and I reversed down the dirt track far faster than was safe, branches scraping against my windows. I didn't slow down until I hit paved road, and even then I drove well above the speed limit until I reached Traverse City's limits. I didn't stop there either, driving straight through town and continuing south, determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and that orchard. It wasn't until I reached Grand Rapids, over 150 miles away, that I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a rest stop and try to process what had happened. In the safety of a crowded highway rest stop, I examined my injuries. Dozens of wooden splinters embedded in my skin, some so deep they would require surgical removal. More disturbing were the tiny leaf buds growing from the largest fragments, suggesting the wood was somehow alive and trying to take root in my flesh. I spent hours in the restroom with tweezers and a first aid kit, extracting every visible splinter and flushing the wounds with alcohol. Each removed fragment seemed to writhe between my fingers like a living thing before I consigned it to the flames of my camping stove, refusing to take chances. The smell of burning cherrywood made me nauseous, carrying echoes of screams just below the threshold of human hearing. I spent the next few days in a motel room in Detroit, jumping at shadows and barely sleeping. When I did manage to close my eyes, I dreamed of faces in bark and underground root systems that spanned continents, carrying whispered messages through the earth itself. I was afraid to turn on my laptop or charge my phone, convinced the entity might somehow reach me through technology. When I finally gathered the courage to check my digital camera's memory card, what I found nearly broke me. Every photo I'd taken in the orchard showed me standing among the trees, but in each successive image, my body was gradually transforming, becoming more wooden, more absorbed into the background. In the final shot, only my face remained recognizable, my expression one of profound terror as cherry branches erupted from my eye sockets. After a week of hiding, I forced myself to research what had happened to me. The Traverse City Library's historical archives revealed that the Odawa people had indeed maintained a ceremonial site near the Harmon property, where each year their shaman would spend a night communing with what they called the Red Spirit beneath the trees. European settlement disrupted this tradition, and the first documented disappearance in the area occurred just 3 years later. The Harmon massacre was real too. Official reports blamed it on a drifter, but first responders' personal accounts described cherrywood splinters throughout the house and bodies positioned in ways that would have been physically impossible for a human attacker. Most chilling was what I discovered about the annual missing persons cases. Each year, exactly one visitor disappeared in the Grand Traverse region between September 21st and 29th, the autumn equinox period when traditional belief held that boundaries between worlds thinned. I found photographs of several victims, and with growing horror, recognized their faces among those I'd seen in the barn. The pattern had been consistent for decades, suggesting the entity was indeed maintaining some kind of boundary through these sacrifices, containing itself to the orchard but requiring regular feeding to do so. And now it had marked me, had accessed my memories, knew everything about me. Would it somehow find me next September, no matter where I hid? 2 weeks after my escape, I received an unmarked package at the motel, impossible since I hadn't given anyone my location. Inside was my Hasselblad camera, apparently unharmed but smelling faintly of cherries. With trembling hands, I opened the back to remove the film, only to find the camera empty. Instead, tucked into the film compartment was a small piece of cherrywood carved into the shape of a key, along with a note written in what appeared to be dried blood. The boundary weakens. Only a willing keeper can restore it. You have until next September to decide. The implication was clear. I could return voluntarily to become the new guardian, or risk the entity breaking free of its weakened containment, with consequences I couldn't begin to imagine. The ultimate cruelty of my situation became clear as summer waned into autumn. I'd fled to Arizona, as far from Michigan as I could reasonably get, but the dreams only intensified. I began finding cherrywood splinters under my skin that I had no memory of acquiring. My photographs, regardless of subject, gradually developed subtle images of trees in the background. Most disturbing of all, I started receiving text messages from my own phone number, counting down the days until next September. I consulted psychics, priests, even a nuclear physicist, anyone who might understand dimensional boundaries and how to reinforce them. Their answers were discouraging. Such boundaries, once weakened, required enormous energy to repair. Energy often derived from consciousness, from life force, from willing sacrifice. It's now August, nearly a year since my encounter at the Harmon Orchard. I've made my decision. This journal, which I'm posting publicly, serves as both warning and explanation. By the time you read this, I'll be driving back to Traverse City, back to that dirt track and the abandoned orchard. I know what awaits me there. An eternity as the new keeper, my consciousness used to reinforce the boundary containing the Red Harvester. But the alternative is unthinkable, that entity breaking free, spreading beyond the orchard, consuming consciousness across Michigan and potentially beyond. The faces trapped in those trees were horrible, but their suffering would be multiplied 1,000-fold if I don't return. If you're reading this and considering a photography trip to the cherry orchards around Traverse City, stay on the main roads. If you see an overgrown dirt track leading to abandoned trees, drive past without slowing down. If you happen to visit in September and see a new face among the cherry trees, one wearing a modern expression of grim determination rather than stark terror, know that I made this choice willingly. The boundary will hold for another generation. And perhaps, decades from now, another traveler will recognize the signs, understand what's at stake, and make the same choice I did. Because some hungers can never be satisfied, only contained, and some sacrifices must be made willingly to have any power at all. The Red Harvester waits in the orchard, but as long as I remain, it waits alone.